Welcome to our third lecture in which we're going to continue discussing the business letter. In our first lecture, we discussed just generally how to format a document. We talked about the letterhead, we talked about where the date goes, where the mode of delivery goes. We talked about the inside address and the various aspects of that, and we discussed the ray line and the salutation. Now we're ready for the body of the letter. Obviously, the body is where you're going to spend most of your time as a legal writer. It's the only part really that involves some level of creativity. The rest of it's pretty much a rote process of formatting, but the body is where you get to shine as a legal writer. That is a topic that you'll learn a lot about in legal writing. In this course, we're all about formatting, so actually, even though this is the most important part of the letter and the most interesting part of the letter to prepare, we're not going to spend a ton of time on this. But I do want to introduce you, first of all, to the various rules about the body of the letter, and then go through some considerations that you should make as you draft the letter. But just to be clear, most of the points that you will earn or lose when you're writing business letters in this course are going to be focused on the format, not the content. There will be opportunities to lose some points on content, but that's a less important part for this class. Okay, so you're going to want to leave one blank space between the salutation and the body. In other points, I talk about, well, maybe you can do one or two, or maybe you can even just do none. But for this one, you need to have just the one space, okay? So this one, there isn't any range of possibilities. And then we're going to tab once at the beginning of each paragraph. So each paragraph will be indented once. Now, we've talked about using the tabs that are preset, these tabs right here. They're usually going to be at the 1/2 inch. You can have another preset. The important thing, though, is that you have all the same presets. So the amount of your paragraph indentation is going to be the same as your ray line indentation, for example. Now, you don't want to have a tiny indentation. You don't want to have a weirdly long indentation. So really the preset is about where you want to be. But if for some reason, maybe if you did it a little bit less, maybe you would be able to make your letter somewhat briefer, and that's going to let everything fit on the line. You know, could it be, maybe uh, 3/4 of 1/2, which I guess would be, I guess maybe that would be 3/8 of an inch. Would that work? Yeah, sure. Would a 1/4 of an inch work? Yeah, that'd probably be okay if you were in a pinch. I'd probably stick with the 1/2 inch if there weren't any reasons about spacing. And again, for this class, there won't be, so there's no need to worry a lot about saving space. You only tab for that first line, and remember to do it for each one of the paragraphs. Most of the time people remember to do it for all their paragraphs, but sometimes they forget for that last paragraph. And so just make a mental note to look at each paragraph to make sure it's indented. In addition to the indentation, which tells the reader, hey, this is a new paragraph, you're also going to leave a blank line between each paragraph. Now, because we are having this at add and add in our formatting area, you will actually need to create that blank line. It's not going to automatically cause that blank line to appear. We've already talked about the 2+2 rule. That's a rule that means you have to have at least 2 paragraphs, and all of your paragraphs except for the last one has to contain at least 2 sentences. These are minimums. You can have a lot more than 2 sentences, and you can have a lot more than 2 sentences in each paragraph, and you can have a lot more than 2 paragraphs. But if you, for whatever reason, for example, maybe it's a cover letter that you are filing a answer or something, you really don't need more than 3 sentences. Well, you're fine. Just you put 2 sentences in your first paragraph and 1 sentence in your second paragraph. So the total minimum number of sentences you can get away with is 3, and you need to have those in the 2 paragraphs. So that last paragraph, as we discussed in the interoffice memo, is formatted, or excuse me, it's not formatted differently, but the contents are usually going to be things like, if you have any questions, please contact me. It's really just almost a throwaway sentence. You can write it in your sleep, and you're going to include your telephone number in that area, in that last line. Now you may say, well, but my telephone number is already in the letterhead. Well, probably that's the switchboard number. If you're sending a letter to somebody, it's usually a best practice to go ahead and give them your direct line. But perhaps in your law firm, the practice is to have everyone go through the switchboard. So you can include the switchboard number there. Yes, you could say, well, I don't have to, it's already on the letterhead. But again, our goal here is to make it as easy as possible for the reader to get the information. And people who frequently read business letters have been trained kind of to expect that telephone number in that last sentence. I mean, yes, it's also on the letterhead, but they're really focused on maybe that last sentence. So if you put it in both places, you're probably increasing the chances that the reader is going to get the information that he or she needs. Sometimes at the top of a letter, even above the date, uh, people will put their direct line number. So it almost looks like it's part of the letterhead. We're not doing that in this class, but I want to alert you to the possibility of doing that. It's a little tricky to do, so it looks good, but once you figure out a way to do it with a particular letterhead you're working with, I think that that can be a really helpful approach to the document. But again, for this class, we're not doing that, so please don't worry about it. Do remember the 2+2 rule. And yeah, so you're going to include the writer's telephone number. You can also include email. I wouldn't just include email unless there's some reason why a telephone number isn't going to work. Maybe y'all are in the process of moving, or maybe you're having some difficulty with your telephone lines. So these are the formatting rules that you need to be aware of. But obviously, whenever you're writing something, there's a lot more than formatting to contend with. So let's look at some of the substantial issues that we are going to be facing. And again, if you haven't had a chance to write down all the things above here, do be sure to pause the screen and jot down all of these hints. These are going to be directly applicable to the assignment that you're working on. And since we have several letter assignments in this class, you're going to want to refer to this many times. And 6 weeks from now, you might not remember everything that we talked about today. Okay, so let's look at the comments. Big thing is to proofread your document carefully. You may even want to have a family friend uh, or somebody to proofread it. Usually you should be completing these assignments on your own, but this is one exception that I do allow others to proofread, because the reality is it's really hard to find your own typos. You've probably seen that sometimes in my documents where I miss a typo. I proof everything as hard as I can, but I miss them. And I'm very fallible. You may be less fallible than me, but I'm guessing you still aren't infallible. And so it's a good idea to have somebody else proofread. If you can't do that, then another approach is to set the letter aside. Be sure that you work on to get your document exactly the way you want it, at least a day before you're going to submit it. Because if you're able to get yourself some distance from it, it's a lot easier to read what's actually there than what you are hoping is there. Another thing to keep in mind is Microsoft Word has lots of proofing tools. You can just run it through this review right here, hit spelling and grammar, and it's going to do it automatically and find lots of stuff. There's also ways of setting this up so you can, so here, let me just show you what I do here. I click on File, and then I go to Options, and then I can do all kinds of proofing choices. Once you're done making these changes, go ahead and hit OK, and that will memorialize your changes. And so when you go in here into the spelling and grammar, it's going to run the way that you want it to run. Word is not infallible. For one thing, it's not designed to be particularly for legal professionals. So, it's designed to meet lots of different people's needs. And as a result, it's not going to always give you the best advice. So you have to use it cautiously. It's going to sometimes tell you, hey, make this correction when you in fact shouldn't. And it will sometimes fail to give you advice that would have been helpful. Having said that, it's helpful probably 80+% of the time. As long as use a critical eye when you're doing it, it can be very, very helpful. It can be that extra set of eyes. Another thing is we aren't going to use contractions in this class. So whenever you see an apostrophe, when you're proofing it, go back and look to see, is that a contraction apostrophe or is it a possessive apostrophe? You will need to use possessive apostrophes because they're not contractions. For example, let's just look at this example. Mary's purse is green. We don't mean Mary is purse or Mary has purse. This apostrophe S is not a shortened version of some verb. Instead, this means the purse that belongs to Mary is green. We're showing possession, not contraction. In contrast to that, we have two contractions. Isn't. Whenever you see N apostrophe T, that's a contraction of the word is not. I mean, in this case, not, right? We have can't, hasn't, isn't, lots of different forms of that. And so whenever you see N apostrophe T, you know it's a contraction and we just shouldn't use it in legal writing. And that's for anything in this class. Sometimes though you will see apostrophe S or also apostrophe D. You'll see he'd, let me just do this here, is short for he had, or I'd could be short for I would. Lots of difference. But so when you see an apostrophe D or an apostrophe or N apostrophe T, you know right away it's a contraction. That's really the only thing it can be in English. But when you see an apostrophe S, it could be this or it could be this. This you're going to keep, this one you shouldn't keep. So how do you know which one to use? Well, when you see apostrophe S, try changing the apostrophe S to is or has. If it makes sense, if it doesn't change the meaning, then yes, it's a contraction. So when I see it's, if I can replace it with, like, let's say my sentence is, it's sunny. Well, does it make sense to say it is sunny? Sure does. Does it make sense to say it has funny? No. So it must be a contraction of it is. But let's look at our sentence, Mary's purse is green. Can we say Mary's purse is green? No, that makes no sense. How about Mary has purse is green? That also doesn't sound like English. And so we know that this isn't a contraction. The apostrophe S is either a contraction of is or has, or it's possessive. Once you kind of know what those options are, it's pretty easy to test it to see which category it falls into. I'm going to make a suggestion. Many of us, when we write, we use contractions so commonly that it's hard to see them when we are writing in the legal world. And since we're not supposed to use them, I recommend that you just discontinue using them at all, at least for a time, so you kind of break that mental habit. And then if you want to reincorporate them into your everyday casual emails, awesome, wonderful, go for it. That hopefully will give you the ability to kind of distinguish between the two. But I get a lot of students who submit documents with contractions who I know have heard that they're not supposed to, but it's so easy to stay on the automatic pilot. Let's go to the next idea. Bulleting. Bulleting is awesome. I highly encourage it in legal writing and all other forms of writing. It really directs the reader's attention to that material. So when you do bullet, you want to make sure those are the rock stars, the most important part of the document. Sometimes students will bullet things just because they're bulletable. They're a list, even though that's not that important to the purpose of the letter or the document, whatever it may be. And that isn't a good use of bulleting. So use it when it's really what you want the reader to leave with. If it's a kind of a trivial point, the reader will notice it, but the reader will notice that instead of the stuff that you really value. When you bullet, you ordinarily are not going to write your bullets in complete sentences. You can, that's okay to do, but most people don't. And it's fine to have what I'm going to call a sentence fragment in a bullet. That's not a problem. Anywhere else, you need to have complete sentences. But in bullets, you don't have to. You can have a list. If you don't have it as a complete sentence, though, you shouldn't end with any punctuation. You shouldn't have a comma. You shouldn't have a semicolon, you shouldn't have a colon, you shouldn't have a period unless there's an abbreviation at the end and you're using the period for the abbreviation. Another thing that's important to keep in mind when you do bullets is you need to have parallel structure. Again, we're going to talk about this later in the course. I'm not going to spend time on this right now. But what this requires is just that your parts of speech match up. If you start one bullet with a verb, you need to start all the bullets with a verb. If you start each bullet with a noun, you need to start all the bullets with a noun. Again, just save that as an issue to be considered as we advance in the course. The next thing is passive voice. Many of y'all have already taken one of our courses in the program, or in another college or high school course you've learned about passive voice. Awesome. If you know about it, be sure to avoid it. Passive voice is not always a bad choice, but it is always a bad choice in this course because we're trying to break a habit. Many of us, and I include myself in this, routinely are inclined to use passive voice in our first draft. And that's fine. First drafts are meant to be just kind of pouring ink on paper. But once you're ready to be done with it, be complete with the assignment, you'll want to go through and change all those passive voice sentences to active voice sentences. Microsoft Word is tremendously helpful in rewriting these sentences. They will tell you, they will help you identify passive voice if you struggle with that. They don't always help you rewrite it. That can be a bit of a trickier activity. We'll cover this more later on in the course. But I will tell you right now kind of why we avoid passive voice. For one thing, if you have passive voice in a sentence, your sentence is almost certainly going to be longer. And again, we're trying to keep our sentences sharp, pithy, direct, energetic. And so passive voice being longer is sucking some of that energy out of the sentence. That's problem one. Problem two is a lot of times when you use passive voice, you end up using nominalizations, which is going to be our topic in our next bullet here. And nominalizations also suck the energy out of a sentence. Second is it creates ambiguity. Many times people use passive voice to avoid saying who's doing a particular thing. For example, I might write an assignment that says, points will be taken off if you do X when you submit the assignment. Well, who's taking off the points? I am, but I don't want to own that. I don't want you to be mad at me. And so instead of saying I will take points off, I'm going to kind of dodge the issue and act like kind of magically points disappear. Well, no, magically points don't disappear. I have to subtract them. And so by using passive voice, sometimes we like to dodge the issue. Sometimes that's a good legal strategy, but many times it's just kind of being sloppy and careless with how we write. And it can create ambiguity. Sometimes, for example, in a contract, if you write a sentence like, the mortgage will be paid. Well, who's going to pay the mortgage? That's pretty important to know, right? If it's a contract about that particular house, you want to put someone on the spot saying, Bob agrees to pay the mortgage, not somehow or another somebody will pay the mortgage, because what if the mortgage doesn't get paid? Who's responsible for it? Bob could say, well, it doesn't say I'm responsible for it. I can respond what everybody understood, that you were the one who was going to do that. And Bob's response is going to be, you should have written it that way. And guess what? He's going to be right. So avoid passive voice. Here and again, if you aren't fully comfortable with what it is, we'll be talking about it later in the course. Avoid complicated tenses. Usually you're going to want to have no more than 2 verbs in your verbal phrase. There are times where complicated tenses are merited, but if you start finding your verbal phrase is 3 or 4 words long, that's an indication that you may be adding unnecessary complication and confusion for your reader. An example of a long verb might be, Bob will have been eating the steak for 2 hours. Our verbal phrase here is will have been eating. That's 4 words. How about just saying either will eat the steak for 2 hours or maybe is eating the steak for 2 hours, whatever the facts support. So if you start finding yourself falling into really complex tenses, it's probably a good idea to streamline them. The nominalizations, again, we'll talk more about this later on. These are super long words that are nouns, and typically they begin by being verbs. It's a good idea to keep the energy, the activity, the heart of your sentence in the verb, not in the nouns. And so an example of that really quickly is if we had this sentence, Bob will give information to Mary. We could write that. This is nominalization. Information is a nominalized noun. We could say instead, Bob will inform Mary. Or even probably better, Bob will tell Mary. You can see that this is a much shorter sentence and it's a much more vigorous, interesting, action-oriented sentence. So when you see long words, consider whether you can change that word to something shorter. Now, information is a perfectly grammatically correct word, and I'm not saying you can never use information. Absolutely you can. But if you find that all of your sentences have really long nouns like that, it's a good idea to trim some of them. Comma usage. Again, we're going to talk about this later on. A good rule of thumb, though, is whenever you use a comma to know why you're using the comma. Not just say, gosh, it feels like a comma goes here, but no, oh, I'm applying X rule to that. If you haven't gotten the habit of doing that, do it. And if you do it for 6 months, you're going to know all the rules because there's less than 20. And once you get those under your hat, you'll be in good shape and you don't have to worry about commas because you'll know where they go and you won't really even have to think about it. But if you don't know where they go now, give yourself some time and some patience to learn where all those go. We'll be covering it as we go forward in this semester. So something to look forward to or dread, depending upon your comma enthusiasm. Check pronoun usage. Again, this is a topic we'll also talk about. My recommendation is whenever you have these words, they, their, them, this, that, yeah, those are probably the ones that are most important. Whenever you have these words that you use them in the body, these are kind of danger words. I mean, they're perfectly grammatically correct. I'm not saying they're bad, but many English users routinely misuse these words. And so one approach is to, when you're done with the document, to do a word search. Just go over here to find and type in whichever one of these words you want to run through the first time. And then once you find them, you go back and see, well, did I use the word they correctly? Then do there. Did I use each time it pops up? If you don't know how to use these words correctly, feel free to stop by my office hours or work on, when we get to that unit, work on that to kind of master that. Many of us have a habit, and I'm in that group right along with many other people, of misusing these words in spoken English. That's fine. People always do that. But when you move to written English, we in the legal area need that precision. We need, if we have a plural pronoun, we need to have a plural antecedent. If we say this without a noun after it, we need to make sure we're referring to a specific word that has appeared previously in our document. So there's some finer touches that we need to apply there. Again, sometimes people tend to adopt their verbal style in their writing, and our verbal style oftentimes is to misuse those words, so be sure you're checking those. And also check for sentence fragments. We've already covered that unit about sentence fragments, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. If sentence fragments is an opportunity that you have, please stop by and you and I can work on them some more. It's interesting. Many students never have sentence fragments and many students have them fairly commonly. It's not, for whatever reason, just some people's brains are wired a little differently in this area. So it doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with you if you are prone to sentence fragments. It's just something to work on, just like we all have things to work on. But it's not going to solve itself. So please feel free to stop by and we can talk about it in more detail. Then keep your sentence length about 20 words. We talked about in emails and in the interoffice memo that you really want to have each sentence be under 20 words and probably, you know, maybe under 18 or 17. Sentences in a letter can be a bit longer. They're a little bit less of a rushed type thing. And so if you have a sentence or two that's 23, 24 words, that's okay. It's not the end of the world. Just be sure that you're counting your length of sentences for each one of them, and that once you find yourself at 25, it's probably time to break up that sentence into two sentences. Now, we don't want to have, 25-word sentences. That would be weird. But do keep in mind that once you're above 20, look it over to make sure that it really is kind of what you want to do with your sentences. Okay, so now we're done with those suggestions. We're done with the body. You can see actually we spend less time on the body than we do probably the inside address. So let's now look at the signature block. So this is what goes after the body of the document. So we're going to have a space between the body of the letter and the signature block. Make sure it's just one space. So this isn't one of these that you can have it be more or less depending upon the spacing of your letter. This is one that you should just have one blank space, but you do need that blank space. So now I said at the beginning when we were talking about setting up the date that there was a reason that we weren't hitting the center button, that we were going to tab over to the approximate center. Well, now I'm ready to do the great reveal. I hope you've been able to sleep at night wondering what the big reveal is. So here it goes. We want the first letter in our date. Let's imagine the date is January 14, 2021. We want that J in January to line up vertically perfectly with our V in very truly yours, or if we're using sincerely, our S in sincerely. If we center it, it's never going to perfectly line up. So we sacrifice the perfect centering in our date so that we could line up our signature block with that date. So that's the big reveal. You probably used about 5 or 6 tabs to get your date to the approximate center. You'll use those exact same number of tabs to start your signature block. You can, again, just count the tabs and remember it, or you can look for the number. Here I have, usually it's about at the 3-inch point, and just make sure all of your date and your signature block line up. And again, you can scroll up and scroll down so that your text gets right below that 3 if you're having some difficulty deciding if you're right on it or not. So the valediction, that's another term for the closing. So that's the very truly yours or sincerely. I'm putting it in quotes just so you can see it and know where it begins and ends, but you wouldn't actually put it in quotes when you put it in the letter. There are other signatures that people use, regards, some other ones, but these are the two we're using in this class. These are bulletproof. Nobody's going to be offended. Nobody's going to think it's unprofessional. So why not use the ones that you know are okay? Whichever one you prefer to use, you can use. Obviously, your firm is probably going to say we always use X, and you're going to use that one. But for our class, you have a choice. So when you're using this, you're going to capitalize only the first letter. So only the V, not the T or the Y. And obviously, sincerely is just one word, so only the S. Then we're going to close it with a comma. Now, we use the comma whether it's a personal letter or it's a professional letter, a business letter. So this doesn't change to a colon because it's a professional letter. Okay? And either with a comma. So then we're going to leave at least 3 lines for the signer to sign. You will know if you're going to sign the letter kind of how your signature is. You need 3, but some people are big signers, and so you might need to put 4 or possibly even 5. If you're preparing the letter for someone else, consider the size of his or her signature. Now, in this class, you always have to have the 3, but if you are pressed to keep something all on one page, you can reduce it to 2 if you don't have a big signer. But for this class, please don't do that. I'm just letting you know for future use that you can. There's no letters that we're preparing that are going to require that you go down to 2 lines. This is a common error that people make, so just be aware that you need at least 3, and you can do more than 3 if you want. Sometimes people want to add a typed signature or a signature file. Those are not done in professional letters, and the reason for that is twofold. The main reason, honestly, is that you don't want to sign it until the person who is going to sign it has blessed it. Now, if you're preparing a letter for your own signature, I suppose you get to decide when it's ready to go. But if you're preparing a letter for the attorney's signature, if you put the signature block in before he or she has green-lighted the letter, then um, who is to, and let's say, you vanish from the planet the next day. Well, no one's going to know or remember, well, was this letter actually approved by the attorney or not? And so even if you were in a law firm that did use signature files, you wouldn't want to add that until after the attorney has blessed the letter if he or she is signing it. And since we're just preparing drafts for the attorney to review, it would be too early to put in a typed signature or signature file. If your law firm somehow used that, you wouldn't put it in until after the attorney, in this case, I'm going to be the attorney when you do assignments, until the attorney says, yep, good to go ahead and do it. The second thing is that that's not a very, I don't say it's not professional, it's not creating the vibe that we want to with our letter. A letter is designed not to be like an email. It's supposed to be kind of a personal thing. And we're trying to make a connection with somebody in a way that's physical with the actual physical paper. And so we definitely do want to include that wet signature. So we actually are going to ask the signer to sign. I mean, I suppose if the signer is away, maybe the attorney is on vacation or on a business trip, there could be times where you actually do some kind of signature file or typed signature. But again, you're not going to do that here because um, I, the attorney, haven't yet blessed the letter if you're having somebody other than yourself sign it. And there's no reason why you couldn't sign it. Okay. So you're going to tab over. If you tabbed over 6 for the very truly yours, you're going to tab over 6 after you've left the blank spots to add your name, your first and last name. If there's a middle initial or a middle name the person likes to use, you can absolutely include that too. You are not going to put any punctuation on that line. You aren't going to use any honorifics on that line. So for example, if I were preparing a letter, I would do Cynthia Ferris Groover. If Bob Smith were signing the letter, he would write Bob Smith. Sometimes people, even people who go by names like Bob, will put their more formal name. They may go ahead and sign Bob, but they're putting Robert Smith on the signature line. That's really for you to decide for this class whether you want to put, let's say you happen to have 2 versions of your name. Your name is Candace, but you prefer to be called Candy, for example. It's your decision whether you want to put Candy Smith as the typed version of your name or whether you want to go with Candace Smith. But that is an option to consider. Then you're going to return to the next line. You're not going to leave any lines blank between the two because again you have this spacing 1.15. That is where the next line is going to begin. You're going to tab over. Again, if it's 6 tabs for the very truly yours, you're going to do 6 tabs for our next line. And that's going to be the title. And you're going to format the title just like we talked about before. You're going to capitalize, let me just add that here. Capitalize all major words in the title. If the signer is an attorney, then you're going to want to follow the practice in your law firm. The assumption is that when a letter goes out under law firm letterhead, that the signer is an attorney unless the signer tells the reader that he or she is not an attorney. So technically you don't have to have a title underneath the attorney's name in the signature block. Some law firms use a title, some law firms don't. And so that would be your decision. For this class, I'm not telling you a particular practice. except when you are signing in as a paralegal, you absolutely have to have that title. It's an ethical issue, so you're not misrepresenting your status as a non-licensed person. You are not going to put your law firm's name or address or anything like that underneath your name in the signature block. Keep in mind, all of that is on the letterhead, so it would be duplicative. So you're done when you put your title on that line. You're done with the signature block at that point. Okay, so now we're going to talk, the rest of the items we're going to talk about are kind of nitty-gritty stuff. I'm not going to lie to you. They go into somewhat minutia, and some of the stuff you may not have been exposed to before. So the first thing are typist initials. These are the initials that tell the reader who's signing the letter and who's typing the letter. Now, what the typist initials don't tell the reader is who actually composed, who wrote the letter. It might be the typist or it might be the signer. You don't get that information in the typist section. This is going to go about 1 or 2 lines below the signature block. This is going to turn on, again, how your letter is spacing out. So let's assume that you typed the letter and that you're signing the letter. It's your name in the signature block. Well, guess what? You're off the hook. There is no typist initials in that situation. In fact, in our law firm, the law firm that we're working for, it's incorrect to include typist initials at that point. So I'm going to take off if you do include typist initials, despite the fact that you wrote the letter, you typed the letter, and you're signing the letter. But let's say you're preparing the letter for the attorney's signature. In that situation, you do need typist initials. So what you do to do typist initials is that you start with the signer's initials. You're going to use his or her initials. They might be 2 initials, they might be 3 initials, just whatever he or she commonly uses. And you're going to capitalize those initials. So here we have Robert Edward Smith. That's our signer. So you could do RES or RS. I would probably use the version that you're using in the signature block. So if you're putting the whole name Robert Edward Smith on the signature line, I would probably go RES. If you're using Robert E. Smith, I'd go with RES. If you're just using Robert Smith, I'd probably go with just RS. So that's the first name. Then we do a backslash without any spaces on either side. And then we type the initials of the typist. Again, this person may simply be the typist, the person typing the letter, or this person may have been the person composing the letter. You don't get that level of information in the typist initials. So in this case, the typist is named Walter Sidney Edmondson. Typically, we just see 2 initials here. So we have the first name initial and the last name initial. It's not wrong if you want to put a 3rd initial. If Robert Sidney Edmondson really, maybe he goes by Sidney and he really would like to include that, that's fine. But usually it's going to be 2 or 3 for the first and 2 for the second. You need to have the signer first, you need to have the backslash, you need to have the typist second, you need to have the signer's caps, you need to have the typist lowercase. That's how you work. Pretty common for people to mess this up. So wanted to flag that. Spend a little time with this. Be sure to write all this information down because you may not have been exposed to it before, and so it's helpful to know what's going on so that you won't miss out on points. Okay, so now let's consider the copy notations. Okay, so these are commonly called the CCs, or sometimes people call them the Cs. Again, you have a little bit of flexibility here. You can make it directly below the typist initials if there are some, or you can make it directly below the signature block. You're always going to have that. Or you can space it out a little bit. If your letter seems to be kind of top heavy, you can kind of elongate it. There are lots of different ways of formatting this. So if you're your own law firm, you may have learned a different way. That doesn't mean there's anything wrong with that way at all. But for this class, we're going to format it in kind of the standard, the conservative approach. And that's going to be lowercase c, and a colon. Now you'll see people do capital C's. You'll see sometimes only 1 C. You'll see sometimes only 1 C that's capitalized. All those are legitimate. There's nothing wrong with those approach. But for this class, we're doing lowercase c, colon. There aren't any periods, there aren't any spaces between the C's. And all this, just like with the typist initials, all of this stuff in typist initials or copy notation all sit on the left margin. They're not indented at all. So after the colon, we're going to tab once, and we're going to list the name of the first person. Let's see, with the first name first and the surname second. Okay, so if I'm sending an email to, an email, if I'm sending a CC to Diana Gordon, I'm gonna have my left margin right here, CC colon tab. Let me turn that on so you can see. Ms. MS period space Diana space Gordon. I'm good to go there. That's the formatting for that if there's just a single CC. But let's say that I have more than one CC, and it's pretty routine that you will. My second line, I'm going to save I'm not going to put Dr. Chang's information on the same line as Miss Diana Gordon. I'm going to go to another line. So this may entail me tabbing twice. Actually, what happened is that the margins flew over. But if we started here, it's possible one tab is going to take me all the way over to my M for Ms. It's possible I might need a tab twice. So, but I do want my D in doctor to line up with my M and Ms. And again, if I'm not sure, they're right next to each other, so it's usually not going to be hard. But I can just slide up to my ruler and just check it out. And then I'm going to, again, do the first name and the last name. Now, sometimes people ask, what order should I use? Really, for this class, I'm not going to require a particular order. I'll just let you know some of the orderings that law firms do. Sometimes they will always put the client first. Sometimes they will do it alphabetical by surname. Sometimes they will group after the client all of the partners, and then all of the associates, and then all of the paralegals, and then all of the support staff. Sometimes they have a particular place they want to put opposing counsel. Sometimes they don't have a rule. So again, our rule is here, there is no rule. As long as you're CCing all the people you're supposed to, I'm not focused on the order. Order becomes more important when you have 20 people on the list. We're going to have 1 or 2 or 3 people, so it's not as big of a deal. Having said that, there are some law firms that get hot under the collar, if you can believe it, about the order. They feel personally aggrieved if they are lower on the list than they feel they ought to have been. Anyway, for what that's worth, that's how the CCs are going to work. We're not going to talk about BCCs because we're not going to do them. Just be aware that there is something called a BCC or a blind carbon copy, and it's something that your law firm may use from time to time. Okay, the enclosure notification comes next, and it's also going to be on that left margin. Again, you can have some flexibility about spacing. Obviously, sometimes we don't have copy notation, sometimes we don't have typist initials, so when you have all 3 of the components after the signature block, when you have typist initials, copy notation, and enclosure, this is the order we're going to use. But, a lot of times you're only going to have 1, 2, maybe 3 of those. So there's some fluidity to here. So we're going to use this for our abbreviation, capital ENCL period. Again, some law firms do it differently. If you have more than one enclosure, you're going to do capital ENCLS period. Obviously, if there's 2 enclosures or more enclosures. So after that, you're going to use that colon like we did before, and you're going to tab. So it's very similar to our format here with our CCs, except of course you're not doing CC, you're doing enclosure. And then you're going to describe the document that we have here. Here, actually, I have a typo. That one. And so you can just, if the document has a formal name, then you're going to give that name, obviously, but sometimes you're just going to describe the document. And so you're going to list them. So this is an example of how that might look. Obviously, if you had only one document, let me just make this go away for a second, then you're going to make that S go away, and it's going to look like that. Now, the way this is formatted, that isn't a very big space, but that's okay. If it's super close, you might want to do another tab, but you really don't want this super far. And you can see this name of this document is taking up a fair amount of space. You kind of want to keep components in 12, 13, and 14 close to the left margin here. You don't want them extending across the page. And so kind of pick relatively short descriptions for the names. Sometimes people refer to documents that are included in the letter as attachments instead of enclosures. There is a slightly different meaning between the two. For this class, we're just going to use the term enclosure. Just know some law firms are picky and they want you to use the right term. And so be aware that there is somewhat of a distinction that you might be exposed to at some point. But for our purposes, we're just going to use enclosure or enclosures. For our letter, we're not going to be including page numbers. If you go to the second letter, as we talked about in, I believe, the first lecture, we did talk about how to format page numbers for additional letters. But even if you have a second or third or fifth or 20th letter, page on your letter, you're still not going to number that first page. And so just be sure to leave that out. I sometimes have students who combine a letter with another assignment, or in some of our later assignments we'll have multiple documents that you'll be preparing. And oftentimes the first or one of the documents is going to be a letter, and then it's going to be some court filing that you're preparing. And sometimes students choose to put them in the same file. I discourage people from doing that, but if you want to do it, okay, fine. But it not only becomes it becomes tricky in that it's more challenging to set up the page numbers and the footers so that it is correct. You can do it, but it's extra work, and if you're not a whiz at Word, you're probably going to get frustrated. It's usually easier just to have them as two separate files. And honestly, in a law firm, that's what you'd be doing anyway. So it's a best practice in terms of practicing what you'll be doing in the real world, and it's just easier. And so it's better to keep that separate. But in any event, however you choose to format it, you are going to want to not put the page number at the bottom or any place on the first page. And then our last aspect is going to be the footer. We aren't going to use footers in our letters. We're going to use footers very commonly in our court filings. In fact, I think all of our court filings has footers. So for this class, don't have a footer on your letters. There are times when law firms do put footers on letters. A lot of times they do it to talk about the fact that a document may be privileged. Let's say you're sending a letter to a client and there may be some information that you want it to be very clear is privileged. Well, putting it in a footer can be a really good place. But again, for this class, we're not going to. If you feel like one of our assignments really would benefit from having a privileged notation, that's great. You can include it either in the ray line, and I think one of my examples, I actually did have it. Let's see here. Oh, yeah, here, I have it right here. Attorney-client communication, privileged and confidential. So you can put it as one of your ray elements, or you can have it in the body of your letter, maybe in that final sentence or maybe in your first sentence. So we're not going to be using footers here, but you may find in your practice outside that footers are more common. Again, that's a variation. Just know that we're going to be using footers in other documents. To introduce you to it, let me just show you how you do them. So you're going to go to Insert, and you're going to go to Footer, and you're going to pick a footer. If you pick this footer, you will see that it's going to start right here. You can just click that away and you can type, let's see, plaintiff's original petition. So you can see that when I typed this, it was automatically in Times New Roman. You can check by just highlighting certain of the words and see what pops up there. If you have set this up so that your default font is Times New Roman, then likely this will work, although I always check because I'm never quite sure if it's going to work or not. But if you haven't done that, even if you've gone through and changed all the fonts in your document, it will not change the fonts in your footers and headers. You have to go back and do those individually. Lots of students will have beautiful documents in Times New Roman, and then they'll have a footer in some kind of sans serif font that is pretty jarring to see. It's no serifs at all. It's just a very different typographical experience, and it kind of sticks out like a sore thumb. You don't want to be that person. And so again, one way of addressing that is to just make the global change. But if you choose not to, or for some reason it doesn't seem to be taking, you'll need to go into your headers and your footers and manually change it to the right font. We'll be doing that pretty commonly, putting footers on going forward, even though we won't be doing it for this letter. So I wanted to introduce you to that concept. So at this point, we're done with letters. We've covered all of the ins and outs of it. I hope that this presentation has been helpful. Certainly, there's a lot of technical points to keep in mind when you're doing the letter. So be sure to go ahead and uh, uh, take whatever pictures you need to. Let me just go back and show you the pictures that or excuse me, the content that we covered here. If you didn't have a chance to write everything down, here's our body and here's our comments. Pause me if you need to. I'm going to scroll down a little bit more. And I'm going to scroll down a little bit more. And we'll go a little bit more. And we are done. So be sure to keep these notes handy, not just for this assignment, but for subsequent assignments that involve letters. Again, thanks for your attention and have a wonderful day.